The topic of this lecture is Anglican and Episcopal mission in the Muslim world, specifically what we would today call the Middle East. So I'm not going to be really talking very much about India and Pakistan. Some areas are really largely left out because while other groups and other churches send missionaries there, Anglicans did not. So there was not a whole lot of missionary activity in North Africa, for example, outside of Egypt. So that's, again, just a kind of a blank spot. And I struggled with trying to decide what title I should give to this. I told you the topic of it, but what's the title of this? And I kept on coming back to a phrase from T.S. Eliot, where he said, "In my end is my beginning." And he also has the other phrase, "In my beginning is my end." And I kept on thinking about that. That's from Eliot's Four Quartets. And I kept on thinking about that as I've just turned over this material in my mind over the last couple of days and indeed years, which is when I started studying this topic. Because I think that Anglicans and Episcopalians, I'm just going to use Anglicans from now on as shorthand, Anglicans by and large, they went to these really distant places like Kurdistan and Constantinople and Salt in Jordan, just to find out that even though they had great, ambitious plans, that in the end, the places where they had started, the situations and the arguments and the differences of opinion that they had started with back in largely England and the United States, had really followed them, and that the mission field in many ways served as a place where those differences could be augmented. They could be written large. Many of the societal forces that would have minimized those differences, say in London or in Connecticut or Richmond, Virginia, or what have you, were absent in the mission field. So they were able to become larger than life. But let me tell you a little bit about some of the main figures here. What do we know about Anglicans, and specifically what do we know about Anglicans who are going to become missionaries in the Middle East? Well, I guess the first period that we'd have to talk about is really not so much missionaries. I mean, remember that Protestants didn't send missionaries anywhere for centuries after the Reformation. Every now and then they would send chaplains. They would send, an English chaplain along with the place, along with the group of people who were going to start what they used to call a factory over in fill in the blank, whatever city they were going to start their factory in. And indeed, that's how a lot of the Anglican communion came into being. But that's a very different thing, though, than appointing someone to be a missionary and to go out and to engage in evangelism, founding new congregations, and so on. So the first period of time that I would want to talk about is really what we would call the period of the chaplains. And I want to just mention two chaplains to you. The first one is a very celebrated figure. His name is Henry Martyn. That's Martyn, born in 1781, and he passed away in 1812. So relatively young man when he died. He was an Anglican missionary in India and Persia, and he was a chaplain. That's how he was able to go. At this time, there was no missionary society of the Church of England, or you couldn't go to your diocesan body and say, "Look, I want to be appointed to be a missionary to fill in the blank." So he went as a chaplain with the, I believe it was the British East India Company, And most of the Anglicans who were going all over the world at this time, in terms of chaplains, they had their job. And their job was to say morning prayer and to say evening prayer and to do the things that chaplains did. And just because you're a chaplain in what would become like Pakistan or Bangladesh, that doesn't mean that you are doing any evangelism. It doesn't mean that you're learning the local language. It doesn't mean that you have any real understanding or insight into the religion or the culture of the people around you. What it means is that you're being paid by a company to fulfill certain religious obligations to the people of that company. And by and large, that's what the chaplains did. Now, there are a couple of exceptions, and I want to give you two of them. One of them is Martin. Now, you'll notice that Martin died fairly young, 81 to 1812. So that tells you that he was a whopping 31 years old or so when he passed away. What kind of stuff did Martin do? Well, he was, I don't know the exact reasons for this, but he was able to engage in a lot more travel, and he had a lot more freedom than did many of the chaplains at the time. And he translated portions of the Bible and the prayer book as well into languages like Urdu, which is one of the predominant languages in Pakistan, and Farsi, which is the predominant language in Persia. Persia and Farsi they're the same word. They're two different ways of saying the same word, or what is today Iran. And Martin was indeed an Anglican missionary. He was an Anglican chaplain, and he died in the city of Tokat. So like so many of these early missionaries, he died in the mission field. The missionaries, their wives, their children, they almost all died in the mission field. And Martin was no exception to that rule. And Martin is one of the first ones. He presaged several of the tendencies that we'd see later on in other missionary activities, especially his love of translation, and also his very evangelical conviction that as long as you can give someone the Bible in their own language, they will that will get them to the Christian faith. There's some kind of powerful sacramental act just in giving the person a Bible in their language that almost assures that, I don't say almost assures, but makes it quite likely that they will become Christian. And indeed, when we read testimonies of Muslims then and now, coming into contact with the Bible is indeed one of the main avenues or factors that we find in those conversion testimonies. So Martin was a chaplain. Another chaplain was a guy named Henry Mondrell, and he was earlier than Martin. This is a very early chaplain, and he was with the Turkey Company. Okay, so the British Turkey Company. So this is a trade conglomerate or a trade company that did commerce between Turkey or Anatolia and the UK, or Great Britain. And he wrote what would go on to be published and translated. He wrote a great book that you can get on books.google for free if you don't mind sitting in front of your computer and reading for hours, which I don't mind. I don't like it, but I do it. And he, in 1697, so notice how early that is, 1697. So this is many decades before our country even comes into existence. In 1697, he and some of the other employees of that company made their pilgrimage down to Jerusalem, and he passed the Triduum from Good Friday to Easter Sunday in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre with the Latins or Roman Catholics in 1697. And his book is just really enjoyable, and it's got great passages from his visit to Jerusalem, but also several other places, including he stopped by Nazareth. It also has some nice maps and some drawings in it that are worth your time. But at this point, again, remember, this is a chaplain. So when he's doing this, when he's going to Jerusalem and traveling through these villages that are Palestinian or Arab or what have you, including largely Muslim villages, he's not going there to evangelize. I mean, he has his job, he's got time off, and he knows that during this time off he can go down to Jerusalem. Or indeed, maybe going to Jerusalem as a chaplain with some of the other employees of that company, maybe that was part of his job. I'm not sure on that detail. But the point is, he was definitely not going out there to start a church. One of the things that I really enjoy about his kind of travel log, or the record of his journey, is that it is replete with scriptural references. This is a man who knows the Bible like the back of his hand, including some of the rather obscure ones, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and where different battles occurred and stuff like that. So that was an influential volume. So those are two examples of the chaplain period, the chaplaincy period, when you did not have organized missions, but you had Anglicans going out and being in other places, and in some cases, like Martin, translating scripture into local languages. In the case of Mondrel, writing down what he saw back for the audience at home. So it was an important beginning, but not what we would generally consider today to be missions. Now, in 1792, okay, so this is when Henry Martin is a young boy of 3 years old or so. 1792, this is when Henry Martin is 11 years old. In 1792, a Baptist named William Carey publishes a book with one of these charmingly prolix titles, An Enquiry into the Obligation of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathens. He becomes a Baptist missionary to India, and like all the missionaries, he dies there. But this book is going to change it's going to just change history, really. The book is short. Again, you can find it for free online. Thanks be to God, this stuff wasn't copyrighted back then. And in this book, Carey is saying, look, you can't just assume that the heathens are going to kind of on their own spontaneously decide to be Christians. You have to use means. You have to use financial means. You have to use organizational means. You have to found societies who are able to coordinate this work and who know about this work. Because then, as now, if you go to your average parish and you say, well, what does it entail being a missionary in the Middle East? The average parish, even if it's very missions-minded, is going to say, we really don't know. If you go to your average parish and you say, what should we do in terms of getting health insurance, like international health insurance for missionaries? Your average parish is going to say, we have no idea. So you have to have societies, organizations that specialize in this sort of thing, that know how to do this, and that can come alongside the established church and help the church to do this. And this is the beginning of all the different missionary societies. So eventually, it takes them a while, but the Church of England catches up with this, and it'll take the Episcopal Church in the United States quite a bit longer. So let me just throw some dates at you. 1799, okay? So this is 7 years after the publication of this book. The most venerable and important of all the missionary societies of Anglicanism is founded, and that's the CMS, the Church Mission Society. I think the name says it all, the Church Mission Society. And many of the characters that we're going to run into in the coming narrative are indeed CMS missionaries. And the CMS is still alive and around today. I've met many CMS missionaries over the years, and they're fine people. So unlike the DFMS, which is the American response to that, the DFMS no longer sends out missionaries. It's ironic. We'll get to the DFMS in a minute, though, but the CMS still actively sends out missionaries to different parts of the world. And not just short-term missionaries to go somewhere for, a few months or a few weeks. Long-term missionaries who will go for years and years, learn the language, serve the people, work with the church, engage in evangelism, so on and so forth. So the CMS is diminished, but still alive and kicking. The CMS is founded in 1799. And then, and specifically for our own Anglican history in Palestine and Jerusalem, this is going to be an important group. It is in 1809, it is founded, and it's called the London Jews Society, LJS, the London Jews Society, which I believe today has a different name. They're called the CMJ, which is the church's ministry to the Jews, or the church mission to the Jews, or something like that. But the LJS was founded with a different purpose than the CMS. The LJS was part of a millenarian movement at that time, which when they read the Bible, when they read passages from Romans and Revelation and so on, they said, before the return of Christ, the Jews are going to, in large number, turn to Christ. And therefore, we are going to organize this society to send out and to fund missionaries who will focus on this vocation of evangelizing the Jews. And many of their missionaries were, in fact, Hebrew Christians themselves. They would not have used the title Messianic Jew. They did not have that title at the time. But on the other hand, they certainly would not have said that they had converted to Christianity in terms of, I'm no longer Jewish, but now I am Christian. That would not have been a concept that they would have endorsed either. So they were Hebrew Christians. Okay, so not Gentile Christians like presumably most of us, but Hebrew Christians. And the LJS had numerous Hebrew Christians among its people, and we're going to get to some of those people here shortly. 1799 and 1809, the CMS and the LJS. There are other groups that are established as well. The SPCK, the Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge, and SPG, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, and so on. But for our focus, where we're looking, CMS and LJS are two of the main bodies that we need to keep in mind. Well, during this millenarian period, you have people then, as now, and yes, these were Anglicans, and they would read the book of Revelation, and they would be very impacted by, the scrolls and the bowls and so on and so forth, and the keys and all these great apocalyptic images. And one of the verses that really kind of creeped into a lot of people's minds was this obscure verse from, I believe it's Revelation chapter 6, and it says, "And the Euphrates will be dried up in preparation for the kings of the east." In preparation for the kings of the east. So you put all this together, the idea that many Jews are going to come into the kingdom. You put this together with an ascendant British Empire, and with a declining Ottoman Empire. You put this together with the ability to go out and to explore, and you really come to the next period in history. And again, I'm not going to give you discrete years, because you can never really do that in history. It's very hard to say the period of the chaplains ended in such and such a year. The period of the explorers began in such and such a year. But a man named Joseph Wolf. Now, Wolf was born in 1795, making him about 14 years younger than Henry Martin, though he would live much longer. He was born in Germany, and he was a Hebrew Christian. He was baptized originally as a Roman Catholic, and only later on moved into the Anglican communion. He wrote, he was prolific, he wrote quite a bit, and he traveled all over the place. So this is when we have moved from the period of the chaplains into the period of the discovery, the journeys, the researches. That's probably the best way to put it, the period of the researches. And Joseph Wolf, who gains a reputation as being incredibly impetuous and courageous, and he's going all over the place. I mean, he's going into all these places, and he's actually looking for the lost tribes of Israel, because he's going over there so he can preach to the lost tribes, and also in preparation so that the kings of the east, who are presumably these lost tribes, so that they will be able to come and cross the Euphrates and engage in this millenarian battle over in the plain that is below Armageddon, or Armageddon, as it is more popularly known, which for me is very ironic, because for me the valley of Armageddon is not, it's the valley I drive through when I'm on my way to Tel Aviv, so it maybe doesn't have some of that mystique that it has for some people. But anyway, and Wolf travels all over the place, all the way into Mesopotamia, Armenia, Kurdistan, and he eventually publishes, again, numerous books, but the Travels and Adventures of the Reverend Joseph Wolf is one of the key volumes that he publishes. Well, he never finds the lost tribes, but again, this is a period of journeys. This is a period of researches. This whole massive area of the globe is unknown to Christians. Remember, it was Christians that decided to figure out a different way to get to the Indies so they could trade. Because the Ottomans, let's just say they didn't give very good customer service. You know, your merchants, they were not secure. They didn't have rule of law. Maybe one time they could come through and the local ruler was in a good mood and you were fine. Maybe the next time he decided he didn't like you, so he just let his people butcher your merchants. Maybe you got a firm guarantee from the Ottoman port in Istanbul, or really Constantinople, saying you have safe passage, and that would have worked in the British Empire, that would have worked in the French Empire, but it didn't work with the Ottoman Empire. You know, the guy would look at it and say, well, this is more of a recommendation, and it was just an extremely dangerous and hectic thing, and Christians, not just because of missionary zeal, but indeed for economic and political reasons as well, they did not want to go through that land. They wanted to find a different way to the Indies. Now, what you have here then is not all these, but a couple of courageous, or maybe foolhardy, depending on how you judge a person's character. You get a couple of these people and they're saying, I'm going to just go in there, I'm just going to travel all over the place. Probably the most famous of these volumes, I mentioned the one by Joseph Wolf already, which has the rather outrageous title, the Travels and Adventures of the Reverend Joseph Wolf. But probably the most famous one of it is just called Researches in Armenia. And like all books back then, these books have these really lengthy titles, but we usually abbreviate them. So Researches in Armenia is published by two American Presbyterians. It's not published by Anglicans, but Researches in Armenia just opens wide the imagination of a generation or two of missions-minded individuals. And now they hear about the mountain Kurds, and they hear about the Nestorian Christians, or those whom today, because of Anglican missionaries, we would call Assyrians. They hear about all these exotic and amazing groups of people, and it just piques your curiosity. It had been before out of mind, out of sight. Well, now it's in your sight, or rather out of sight, out of mind. Now it's in your sight. Now you've got that book there, and you can read about the adventures of Joseph Wolf, or you can read about the missionary researches in Armenia and the surrounding countries. And that book was published in 1834. I'm not sure if there's an earlier edition, but the one I'm familiar with is 1834. And that was published by two, like I said, two Americans named Smith and Dwight. Those were their surnames. Well, Joseph Wolf was part of this age of exploration. And of course, he was not successful. He never found the lost tribes of Israel. And also, he never figured out who exactly the kings of the East were. But he made a real contribution in terms of just the knowledge of what these different cities were like. And what would it be like to prepare to go be a missionary in, say, Baghdad or Isfahan or what have you. Now, there's a couple of other people that are worth mentioning. And most of the CMS people were Anglicans, but not all of them. And I think that Carl Fander, that's Pfander, he's a CMS missionary to Agra in North India. And the reason I mention him is because this is when you're starting to get into the age of, or not the age, but into the movement of polemics. Okay, polemics, not in terms of being mean or being rude, but really saying, you Muslims believe in X, Y, and Z, here's why X, Y, and Z are wrong. Now, maybe your kind of pluralistic Episcopalian sensitivities are injured by this today, but this is exactly the language that many Muslims know, and they understand it. And Fander wrote a book engaging in this sort of polemic. And Fander is German, and I think he was Lutheran. I don't think he ever became Anglican, though. I can check on that. And he wrote a book called Mizanul Haq, which means the balance of truth, wherein he goes and he vindicates the Christian faith and he refutes certain key teachings of Islam. And it's easily available online. The Mizanul Haq, or just the balance of truth. And Fander, again, with the CMS. Another curious figure that I want to mention is a guy named George Percy Badger. He's one of these figures that kind of has a sort of shady reputation. You're not really sure if you like him or not. And see, Badger was significant because rather than being on the strongly evangelical side, he was on the Anglo-Catholic side. Remember that this is the 19th century, and you have strong voices and strong disagreements in England about this topic of, well, is Anglicanism, reformed, but retaining certain aspects of Catholicism, or is the Church of England one of the three Catholic branches of the Church? And we are not like those other Protestants. We still have apostolic succession. We have bishops. Those guys don't. We still have the 7 sacraments. Those guys don't. This is going to be a huge question, and it's going to affect a lot of things, and we'll get to that in a minute. But Badger was on the Anglo-Catholic side of that, or maybe what some people would eventually call the Tractarian side. And Badger was active both in Iran, or Persia, and he was also then later, he was part of a kerfuffle that happened in the city of Constantinople. Now, what's interesting about the Anglicans over in Persia and Kurdistan is that you've got to understand that there was this thing that was called the Great Experiment. This is not my own phrase. This is a phrase from the Presbyterian scholar of mission Bob Blincoe, Blincoe. And as he was writing his history of Christian missions in Kurdistan, he was analyzing the different missionary strategies that different people were using, and he came to the conclusion, he said, look, basically what these people did was they didn't decide to engage in direct evangelism of Muslims. That's key. They did not engage in direct evangelism of Muslims. Or if they did so, it was on a sporadic, occasional basis. But that was not their program. If you said, sum up for me in 3 or 4 sentences what you're going to do, they would not say, we are going to evangelize Muslims. That is not what they would have said. Rather, they went over there, and this comes out of this whole research movement. The researches in Armenia, the accounts from Joseph Wolf, and many other records as well. And they say, look, we've gone over there and we've seen what happens to people who evangelize Muslims. And they get killed. And we've seen what happens if a Muslim leaves Islam. They get killed. And it's dangerous and it's hard, and really, we've got to figure out some other strategy. How is God going to bring all these Muslims into the church? And they come up with a great idea. Well, what to them seems like a great idea, in reality, it would have some truly disastrous consequences. And this is what Blinko coins the Great Experiment. And this is the Great Experiment. As these people like Smith and Dwight and Wolf and several other explorers went around on their missionary research journeys, they found all these pockets of Christians belonging to these ancient churches. You know, you probably have heard of them. The Church of the East, which is also called the Nestorians. The Anglicans, once they got there, they said this is pejorative. Let's not call them Nestorians, let's call them Assyrians, even though today there's a consensus that these people ethnically have no relation to the historical Assyrians of the Bible, but whatever. We'll call them Assyrians. So that's the Assyrian Church of the East, which did not accept the Council of Ephesus in 431. They ran into non-Chalcedonian Christians, like the Armenian Catholic Church, or rather the Armenian Catholic Apostolic Church, which is non-Chalcedonian. And they just ran into a lot of different groups, small remaining Christian groups. So what they said was, here's how we've got to do this, people. These people, the Assyrians, the Armenians, the Greeks, they already know the language and they know the culture of the Muslims. So let's go and reform those churches, and then those churches will become a light to their Muslim neighbors. That is the Great Experiment right there. So all these different missions, Baptist, Congregationalist, Presbyterian, Anglican, started to really focus their time and energy on the idea of reforming these ancient churches. And they were quite clear that they were reforming the churches. In their minds, by and large, there were a couple of Anglican exceptions, which I'm going to get to in a minute. By and large, when you read the missionary journals and articles of the time, you almost always find these churches called either the decayed churches or the corrupted churches. Some people use just really offensive language, just saying, you know, these Christians are idolatrous, oftentimes superstitious. But thanks be to God, these Protestants who have the Reformed faith, who know that you don't have to do all this ridiculous stuff about like priestly celibacy and you don't need to have a bishop because we got the priesthood of all believers and blah, blah, blah. They come there and they say, look, this is really good. Okay, you're here, you've been here for centuries, but now we're here, and we're going to reform your church. Okay? We've come here, no need to say thank you, and we're going to reform your church. Now, there are two different approaches to how to reform, how to go about reforming these ancient, decayed, corrupted, superstitious, and perhaps even idolatrous churches. And both of them were tried, largely unsuccessfully. One of them was to start with the top. You go and you talk to the patriarch, you talk to the priests, and then it will kind of trickle down. So this is trickle-down missiology. That's not from Blinko, I just made that up. So it's trickle-down missiology. You start with the top guys, and it'll trickle down to the pews. If I had an audience here, I would say, guess why that didn't work, but I don't, so I'm just going to tell you. It didn't work for multiple reasons, and one of the key ones was that this was an extremely hierarchical and monarchical tradition with a strong concept of the episcopate. And so when you started to go to the priests, and especially to the bishops, and especially to the patriarch, and you say, you know what, actually, in the end, every believer is his own priest. And you don't need to, and every believer can and should sit down with the Bible and read it on his own, just being able to have confidence that God's Holy Spirit will guide that person rightly. And all these, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm not saying that these ideas are incorrect or wrong or anything like that, but I am saying that you've got to understand why this would not be a popular message at all when you're going to a patriarch or to a bishop, or indeed even to some priests. This is not something that would make you many friends. So that was one way that people try to reform these decrepit, ancient, decayed, idolatrous, superstitious churches. The other one was to start from the bottom up. You start with the people, you start with the laity. You don't take them out of their Sunday morning Mass or the Divine Liturgy if they're in the Orthodox tradition. You don't take them out of that. But what you do is you add to it. You say, you can keep going to that if you really want to, but you really need to come to the Bible study and study the Bible with us at the missionaries' home on, Wednesday night or whatever. Well, this works for some time, but eventually this also becomes untenable because the leadership feels threatened by it. And eventually the bishops of the church, and this is all under the Ottoman Empire, well, not all of it, mostly under the Ottoman Empire, the bishops of the church, the various churches eventually end up saying, look, if you have anything to do with missionaries, we're going to kick you out. You cannot come to this church anymore. And that ends up being devastating because in the Ottoman Empire, the way that a non-Muslim had legal status, okay, not legal rights, but just an existence as a legal person, was by belonging to what was called a dhimme, which is the Arabic word, or a millet, which is the Turkish word. The millet system is the Turkish Ottoman way of adapting the Islamic dhimme system. And so once the Armenian bishop said, okay, Joe over there, he's no longer part of the Armenian church, he was just a non-person. You could kill him, you could take his stuff, and he had no legal status. He couldn't sue you any more than a tree could. Okay, he had no legal standing. So eventually a Protestant millet is set up, but you should be able to understand why it's such a difficult period for many of these Christians who are in the older ancient churches, but they're attracted to this dynamic, more free-thinking, more exploratory, obviously much more modern approach to the Christian faith. And yet they know that they can't leave their churches, so it's a hard situation. Indeed, this is the situation that will lead eventually to the formation of Arab congregations around in the area of the Transjordan. Eventually, some of the bishops over there, the Orthodox bishop, says you cannot read the Bible, you cannot have a Bible, and also come to the Greek Orthodox Church. So the Anglican bishop says, well, you've pushed us too far. I can't do anything. I have the obligation to establish a congregation for these people. I would have liked to have worked with you, but now I see I can't. Well, you can cut that pizza in different ways and assign more or less blame to different parties. I'm not interested in getting into that discussion, but it was a real big issue, a really difficult and challenging concept and challenging decision for everybody to make. So, how is this relevant to the question of the Nestorians or the Assyrians? Here's what the Anglicans do that's different. See, the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists, eventually, they come to the point where they're like, look, we need to just establish a Protestant church. And they do that. The Anglicans, who are Anglo-Catholic, these are Tractarian folks, and they're over in Kurdistan, what is now Kurdistan, in these mountainous villages where there's all these Assyrians or Nestorians, and they never go the way of proselytism, at least during the period we're looking at up to World War I. They never go the way of proselytism. They always work with the Assyrian church. And that is so interesting, isn't it? Because it goes back to that theme of in my end is my beginning, in my beginning is my end. Here are these Anglican missionaries, and they're saying, in the end, we are going to honor you, even though we have all these reservations about your theology. We don't know why you guys don't like the Council of Ephesus. We don't feel good about that, but in this case, the balance came down when it came to the time of what does it mean to be an Anglican? Does it mean to be Catholic, or does it mean to be Reformed and Protestant? In Iran, or in Kurdistan with the Assyrians, during the time period that we're looking at, they come down on the side of identifying with the ancient churches. And they say, yeah, we may be British, we may have broken ties with the See of Rome during the Reformation in the 16th century. But you know what? We understand you, and we absolutely respect the integrity of your church. So when the Assyrians decide to become Russian Orthodox, because the Assyrians are being massacred on every side by the Kurds, who are all Muslims, and a couple of them are Yazidi. And the Nestorians, they want a protector. They want a big brother with a big stick. The Americans are like, oh, we're not political, which is a totally stupid thing to say in the Middle East, because everything is political. And then the Anglicans are like, well, yeah, we don't quite know what we can do to help you guys. But then the Russians come in and they're like, oh yeah, we've got your back. So the Assyrians, the Nestorians, en masse, many of them become Russian Orthodox, and they all of a sudden realize that the Council of Ephesus was indeed correct. And so they all become Orthodox. And here's the striking thing: when the Assyrian patriarch says, we would like for you to turn over all of your Anglican schools to us, or to our helpers, our new friends, the Russian Orthodox, the Anglicans did it. Now, was that a good move or not? Well, this is history. It's what happened. And now I do want to mention that some of the main actors in these events that are going on over in Kurdistan and Persia, these are not necessarily people from the CMS, which is much more evangelical, but these are people who are sent on kind of like an embassy by the Archbishop of Canterbury. So they have really a special and different way of relating to the church. In any case, the Anglican mission in Kurdistan and Persia seems to be fairly erratic. It starts and it stops, and it's not especially constant, although later on an Anglican church will take ground there, but that is after the First World War. And then that Anglican church will indeed incorporate numerous converts from Shia Islam, including a bishop who's a convert from Islam. But that's That's a different part of history. Well, that's Persia. Finally, okay, so George Percy Badger, who I said, he's one of these guys who goes on this mission to interact with the Assyrians. And one of the things that he does when he's given that task is he goes to the Patriarch Shimon, and he says, "Patriarch, I want to warn you against the Presbyterians, these American Presbyterians. They may say they're great Christians and so on, but guess what? They don't have bishops." Because again, he's Anglo-Catholic. He's a Tractarian sort of guy. And George Percy Badger eventually in 1852 will publish a book called The Nestorians and Their Rituals. The Nestorians and Their Rituals. In 1821, so this is 22 years after the foundation of the CMS, we have the foundation of a really curious, bizarre, strange thing in New York called the DFMS. Now, probably most of you know some about the DFMS. It's the Domestic and Foreign Mission Society. And unlike the CMS or the LJS, or the granddaddy of American mission boards, which is the ABCFM, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Mission, which is largely Presbyterian and Congregationalist. The DFMS is not, technically if you're an Episcopalian, you're a member of the DFMS. That's really what it comes down to. It's really a strange thing. I'd probably got to say 99% of the members of the DFMS don't even know that they belong to a mission society. Now, it's a little bit rich to call the DFMS a mission society, especially an FMS, a foreign missionary society, because the DFMS does not send out, as I mentioned earlier, does not send out permanent, long-term missionaries anymore, and certainly not to this sort of place, certainly not to evangelize non-Christians. I mean, that would be incredibly non-politically correct. And furthermore, my understanding is that they don't work anywhere where there's not an Anglican province, which seems rather self-defeating, because most of the unevangelized parts of the world, by definition, don't really have established churches. So, but the DFMS has a different vision of mission, I suppose, than the CMS back in the 1900s. They really they wanted to convert the heathen, and that's how they would say it. So the DFMS today does grant funds and to hospitals and clinics and so on. So I guess they do help Christians abroad. If you want to consider that foreign missions, then I guess that does qualify. But anyway, this is the Episcopal Church's way of kind of getting on the bandwagon, and that's in 1821. Then I got some dates for you here, and now I want to shift from Persia and Armenia, Kurdistan, that whole area. I want to shift back over to the Holy Land, to Transjordan. Of course, back then it's not called Transjordan, but what is today Israel and Jordan, and indeed Egypt. Well, in 1833, the LJS, the London Jew Society, establishes their first base in Jerusalem. And John Nicolason, who is a Dane and a Lutheran who became Anglican, is one of their missionaries. And John Nicolason and his family, these are to our knowledge, this is the first Protestant family to live in Jerusalem, ever. The first Protestant family to live in Jerusalem. Okay, obviously not the first one to visit Jerusalem or to sojourn in Jerusalem, but to really settle there and say, yes, this is where we live. And John Nicolason, or Hans Nicolason, will become a very important figure in the establishment of Christ Church, which is oftentimes called the oldest church, the oldest Protestant church, or the first Protestant church in the Holy Land. We'll get to the fineries of whether it is or not soon. And John Nicolason establishes his base of operations there in Jerusalem. Now we can move back to the States, because, and we'll get back to the Holy Land in a minute, but we get back to the States and we find a guy named Horatio Southgate, a very obscure figure, but during one of the general conventions of the Episcopal Church, 3 missionary bishops were established. One was for the Indian Territory out in the Wild West, one was for China, and one was for Turkey. Well, let me see if I can get this. He's the missionary bishop for the domains and dependencies of the Sultan of Turkey. I believe that was his entire name, or his title. But first, before he becomes the missionary bishop, Horatio Southgate, born in 1812, and he is born in Portland, Maine, into a Congregationalist family. While he's studying seminary, something happens, and he realizes the errors of Congregationalism and decides to become an Episcopalian, and he does. And then, as an Episcopalian deacon, so not yet a priest, but a deacon, he leaves on his research tour in 1836. So he's been commissioned, he's been appointed by the DFMS, that Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society, to go and to do some researches all around basically the Ottoman Empire and figure out what is the most strategic and advantageous place to establish a missionary base. And you can read the sermon that he gave shortly before he left. And this sermon is quite interesting. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about this sermon, but I want to make a few points. The first one is this. This is very important. The first point is that Southgate, he states explicitly in this sermon, he says, everybody knows that the main theory right now about how to reach the Muslims with the gospel is to reform the ancient churches, and then those ancient churches will evangelize the Muslims. And he refutes that argument. He says this is why that argument is incorrect. He says this is why, and I'm not going to go into the reasons, you can read them online, anglicanhistory.org, or just Google Horatio Southgate. The name of the sermon, which you can read online, is an encouragement to missionary efforts among the Mohammedans, if I'm not mistaken. And he basically takes apart that argument. For example, one of the things he says is, look, no one's ever tried it. Why are we going to go over there and invest all of our time in these ancient churches when no one's really tried to engage with the Muslims? And then in this sermon he goes on to say, look, I think that the most open, the most strategic base for Muslim evangelism is going to be in, or going to be with, the Persian Shia Muslims. And he analyzes them. He said, look, the Persians, they have their own language, they have their own culture, they're Shia, many of them are very secular, a lot of them are not very devout. I think that this is really the place to engage in missions. Well, Southgate goes and he writes his missionary research book, like what I've been talking about. This is the age of research, although we're starting to get into the age of church planting. And he writes his book called Narrative of a Tour. Let's see if I've got this here. Narrative of a Tour Through Armenia, Kurdistan, Persia, and Mesopotamia. That book is published in 1840. Southgate published several other things as well, but that's his main book in terms of sharing the fruit of his own research. He gets back and he says, okay, forget this. We're not going to be able to go to Persia. But he says, I do want to go to Constantinople. So he is basically admitting that he no longer had this vision for direct evangelism of Muslims. That, from my point of view, very unfortunate, because Well, I think Horatio Southgate could have been a great influential figure. But as it is, he's a very obscure figure with a short missionary, well, relatively short, I mean less than 20 years, though he managed to get back to the States and not die there. So he goes off to Constantinople, and he is a missionary to the Greeks. Okay, so after he was a deacon, during that entire tour he was a deacon. He comes back to the States, he's priested, and eventually raised to the station of a bishop, consecrated as the bishop of the missionary bishop of the dependencies and domains of the Sultan of Turkey. And he goes back to Constantinople, where he's a missionary to the Greeks. So he's not a missionary to the Turks, to the Armenians, he's a missionary to the Greeks. And remember, back then, this is before all the Greeks had been purged from Constantinople, so there was a considerable Greek population there. There isn't any more. I mean, the Greeks are almost totally gone from Turkey, as are the Armenians and the Nestorians. I mean, all that's left in Turkey today are a bunch of Turks and some Kurds. So, Turkey has really purged the non-Muslim population from its midst. They've been very successful with that project. But anyway, back then in this period of time, the 1840s, there were still a good number of Greeks over there. And again, he goes there specifically with the intention not of proselytizing proselytizing the Greeks, the Greek Orthodox, but of helping them to reform their church. And he actually gets into a big kerfuffle, again, on this topic. And again, we find the interesting Mr. George Badger present. The full details of the incident are at best obscure, but it appears that Southgate was trying to tell one of the Armenian Christians, look, you need to be aware of these American Christians, these Presbyterians, because they basically want to take you away from your own church. That's what it appears to be. And so there's a war of letters, and Southgate publishes a pamphlet called The Vindication of the Reverend Horatio Southgate, and then the American Board missionaries who are in Constantinople publish their reasons why they're upset, and then Southgate publishes his letter, and this is all going on in the States. And meanwhile, the ABCFM, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Mission, they're talking with the missions board of the Episcopal Church to figure out, hey, what's going on here. Eventually, Southgate returns. He asks General Convention for more funds, for more people. They're either unwilling or unable to provide for those, and his missionary work over there is terminated, and he goes on to long career as a priest in the Episcopal Church mostly in New England, I think. So that's another example of you have people going abroad to run into this question of who are we? What does it mean for us to be us? And if that debate would have happened in the United States in the context of a diocese or a parish, it may have been a very heated debate or argument. I mean, are we more Catholic or are we more Protestant? Are we going to be more sympathetic to the Eastern Christians, or are we going to identify with our historical origin as a Western church? What are we? And if that had happened in a parish or a diocese, it probably, would have taken its toll. But the thing is, since it happened in the mission field, it ended up being the occasion of all this publication and writing and everything. So it just, again, was written large. And you can see how American Christians, and British Christians as well, were able to, with an amazing degree of skill, export their local squabbles to the mission field. The final aspect that I want to mention here, or the final mission field that I want to talk about, after having spoken about Persia, and then, or Kurdistan, much of Kurdistan being a part of Persia, and then after having made those comments on the American mission of Southgate to Constantinople, I want to talk a little bit more about the foundation of the church in the Holy Land. Now, I've already made a couple of notes because I'm trying to go chronologically here. So we already have the foundation of the LJS, and then in 1833 we have John Nicolason, the Danish Lutheran who became Anglican, and he's living there in Jerusalem, the first permanent ones over there. During this period, the 1830s and the 1840s, there is a lot of stuff is happening, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but one of the curious things that happens is that the King of Prussia approaches the Church of England and says, let's go ahead and establish a joint, not an Anglican Episcopal, not a Lutheran episcopate in Jerusalem. Let's establish just a Protestant episcopate in Jerusalem. And that Protestant bishop would be the bishop for all the Protestants, whether they're Anglican or English, basically, whether they're Lutheran, Prussian or German or Danish or what have you, or even something else. This would be the bishop for all of the Protestants. And he says, and I'm willing to fund it fairly generously with a yearly grant of, I don't remember the amount. And eventually, one of the archbishops of Canterbury, or the church leaders in England, they say, yeah, we'll do it. And the rule is that they're going to go back and forth in terms of who gets to choose who's going to be the bishop in Jerusalem. And the first choice goes to the English. Now, this is it's a very hot topic for the Anglo-Catholics. They don't like this at all. And John Henry Newman, or should I say Blessed John Henry Newman, recently, he specifically mentioned that as one of the things that he was upset about, and one of the reasons why he left the Church of England and became Roman Catholic. He said, there's already a bishop over there. Everyone knows that the Orthodox bishop is the bishop. So remember, from the Tractarian or Anglo-Catholic eyes, they would say, look, this is one of the three branches of the church. Why are you going to go send another bishop to be where a place in a city where a bishop already lives? There's one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. The Orthodox Church is one of the three branches. We're one of the other three, and the Roman Catholic is one of the other three, and the rest of them are just a bunch of, sectarians with, without the sacraments and probably without means of grace for salvation. So from their point of view, they've got a strong argument. Well, the evangelicals carry the day on this one, and also there are real political benefits to having a bishop in Jerusalem. The French have their representation there, the Russians do, or eventually will. Jerusalem becomes a more and more important city. Now, during most of the Ottoman Empire, it was just a washed-up cesspool, and it was just a disgusting and disease-ridden, unsanitary, dangerous city. But during this time, it's increasing in its importance. So they send a curious man named Michael Solomon Alexander to go and to be the first bishop in Jerusalem, Protestant bishop. Now, Solomon Alexander was born on the continent. I think it was Germany or Prussia, perhaps, back then. And he was a rabbi, so he's rabbi bishop, or is that bishop rabbi? Michael Solomon Alexander is, and he's one of these Hebrew Christians. That's what he is, and so he's like Joseph Wolff. He's come to the conclusion that Jesus of Nazareth is indeed God's Messiah. And again, he never would have identified himself as no longer being Jewish, but of being Jewish, but also Christian, so Hebrew Christian. And he has a vision, this millenarian vision, like so many other people of the time do, and indeed in our day do, that there will be a large number of Jews coming to Christ before the return of Christ, before the second advent of Christ. And he with his wife and his many children, go over to Jerusalem to be part of this missionary effort. And now remember, Nicolason is already there, and I mean, Solomon, or Michael Solomon Alexander, he gets a lot of the credit. He's the one with the name. He was the bishop, but really Nicolason is, in many ways, the one who built that church. Now, the British are also during this period establishing a consulate. They're establishing a consulate in Jerusalem. The Ottomans are deeply indebted to the British because the British have, through their military prowess, preserved the integrity of the Ottoman Empire. When Muslims say that, the imperial period was all about breaking up Muslim hegemony, say that's absolute rubbish. Maybe later on it became about that, but they didn't want to do that at first. At first, the British, or the British and the French as well, they wanted to preserve the integrity of the Ottoman Empire and went to great lengths to do that. It was only after they went in on the wrong side in the First World War that they felt that they had no other option but to chop up the whole region, which is what we have now. So the British had basically saved the Ottoman Empire, or at least Egypt, for the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottomans were indebted, and they said, okay, you can build a consulate here in Jerusalem. And then you get to a very thorny topic, a very difficult thing to talk about, which is building churches in Dar al-Islam. You see, in the Islamic Sharia, it is illegal to build or repair churches in Dar al-Islam without the express permission of the caliph. And at this time there's still a caliph. Remember, there's a caliph up until 1924. So you got to have the permission of the top guy. Now the top guy is, even if he knows politically that he needs to do it, he's not going to do it, even if he has the power to, because he knows that the religious scholars in Istanbul will basically have his head on a plate. So he doesn't do it. So Christ Church is eventually established after very much travail inside the old city, inside the Jaffa Gate. And here's why I said earlier that it's not so clear whether it's a church or not, properly speaking. Because what they got was permission to establish a personal chapel in the residence of the British consul. Now, it doesn't take a genius to realize that there is a legal difference then, as there is now, between having a personal chapel, even a rather large one, and between building a church. If you want to add on a room to your house and maybe have some stained glass and a little altar or table and call it your personal chapel, that would probably be relatively easy to do if you had the funds for it. But if you wanted to buy that, or have that same property and raise the house to the ground and construct a proper church, it could be very difficult for you because of zoning. Well, those complexities are nothing compared to the complexities of the Sharia. So anyway, that's the only way that the Ottoman Empire, or that the Ottoman Porte, is able to satisfy both the British, to whom he owes his throne, and his Islamic scholars, without whom he cannot rule, is by saying, okay, well, it's a church, but it's not a church. And to the British, he says, look, you have a nice church. And to the Islamic scholars, he says, oh, it is not a church. This is a political residence, and I've just given him permission to have his own private place for his devotions. That's an oversimplification of a very long story, but it gets you an idea of how complex the construction of Christ Church inside the Jaffa Gate is. There's a good book that talks more about it. There are two of them, actually, by Kelvin Crombie. Crombie is Crombie, and that's For the Love of Zion. And then one that's more about Bishop Alexander, and that's a Jewish bishop in Jerusalem. So both of those books will shed some more light on the history of Christ Church. Well, Alexander arrives there. I think it takes something like 7 years before they can actually, from the cornerstone to the opening of Christ Church in Jerusalem. And Christ Church, for those of you who have been there, you know that it looks more like a synagogue than like a church. Well, Alexander doesn't last long. Alexander was consecrated as the bishop, the Protestant bishop in Jerusalem, not bishop of Jerusalem, but the bishop in Jerusalem, and he was consecrated in December of 1841. He dies in 1845. He dies in Egypt, and then he's taken back to Mount Zion, where he's buried today. 1846 is when Samuel Gobat becomes the second Protestant bishop in Jerusalem, and he is French Swiss. So, now it's not the English folks' turn; it's the turn of the Lutherans. And again, you can understand why this is such a bold project, because imagine for the Anglo-Catholics, they look at the Lutherans and they say, well, you may call yourself Father Jim and such, but you guys don't even have bishops, so technically you are nothing other than a layman. But when the Lutherans go to the Anglicans and they say, this is Father Sam, and now we just, you guys get your bishops together and consecrate him to be a bishop. And the Anglo-Catholics say, wait a second, he's got to be ordained a deacon and an elder before he can be consecrated to be a bishop. What are you talking about? You can see how complex all this is. And then there's the evangelicals who are just like, we just want to evangelize the Jews, because we know the end is coming. Again, overly simplistic, but it gives you an idea of some of the complexities at play here. Well, Samuel Gobat does become the bishop, and he's basically the man who built the diocese. If Nicolason is the founding father of Christ Church, then Gobat is the founding father of the diocese. Alexander, he was there for too short of a time to really leave a lasting impression. But Samuel Gobat, who will serve as bishop from 1846, so he's 47 years old when he arrives, until 1879. That is when he's 80 years old. Very long-serving bishop, and he dies in Jerusalem, and I believe he's also buried on Mount Zion. He's the one who built that diocese. He opened schools and clinics, and he also, it seemed, cooled to the zeal for evangelizing Jews. And during this time, he's partnering with the CMS a lot. And the CMS are going and doing the same things like the American Presbyterians were doing. They're going out and doing Bible studies and, places like Nazareth and Salt, which was then the main city and what today is the country of Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan. And, like I said, people got kicked out of the churches, and he said, look, you're forcing my hand here, you Orthodox people. And again, he didn't have a high view of the Orthodox like the Anglo-Catholics did. He had a fairly low view of him, I would say, based on what I've read. And so he says, okay, fair enough, we're going to start churches. And that really is when the first proper church, not a chapel that's part of a political residence, like Christ Church, but an actual independent congregation is established. And that is Christ Church in Nazareth, which is the church where me and my family worship oftentimes when we're in Nazareth. And that is in 1871, the church is opened. Christ Church in Nazareth, for those of you who have been there, doesn't have a steeple. It has a tower, and it has just a square top, but no steeple, because they ran out of funds. So that's why it has that kind of curious, strange appearance. So those are two of the earliest churches that we find. And by this time, you are finally at a period where you have fewer and fewer Jewish converts, fewer and fewer people who are identifying themselves as missionary to the Jews. And also, really, you just have a lot more Arabs and Palestinians coming in to the church. Gobat was evangelical. The CMS missionaries were evangelical. And so ultimately, unlike the Anglo-Catholic missionaries in Persia, who just, when the Assyrian patriarch said, "Can you just leave us the schools?" Unlike those guys, they were willing to try to work with the Orthodox authorities, but when it didn't work, and they were able to establish their own churches. The CMS left a very profound and deep Low Church influence in what is today the Diocese of Jerusalem. And I've written about that in some of my articles in Anglican and Episcopal history. In 1886, there's a third bishop after Gobat, but he only serves for 2 years and he dies. In 1886, the agreement between the British, or rather between the English and the Prussians, is formally dissolved. And in 1887, a man who is suspected of having Anglo-Catholic or Tractarian leanings, named George Francis Popham Blythe, is consecrated as Anglican bishop in Jerusalem. And here we can really speak of an Anglican bishop. He's not the Protestant bishop, he's the Anglican bishop in Jerusalem, right? Not of Jerusalem. And that's 87. He gets there and he finds that the LJS people, who basically have built and have run Christ Church, that they're happy doing their own thing. Again, I don't know whose responsibility that was. I don't know if Blythe was standoffish towards them or vice versa, or some mixture of the two. But he eventually came to the conclusion that he had to have his own cathedral church, because Christ Church was not owned by the diocese. As it is today, it is not owned by the diocese. It was owned by if I'm not mistaken, the LJS, the London Jews Society, owned Christ Church. So imagine being a bishop in Jerusalem and not having your own church building or office or anything like that. Eventually, he will raise funds and have the Cathedral Church of St. George the Martyr, which is to this day the Cathedral Church of the diocese. He'll have that built, so that's under Blythe. And I've also written about that in Anglican and Episcopal history. And St. George's is built in 1898. Just a couple of other short notes. There are some other bright figures like Temple Gairdner, who will go to Cairo. He's a brilliant linguist, ethnomusicologist. He travels up and down the Nile collecting old tunes and devises a way to record them musically. Brilliant translator. But I don't want to talk too much about that. And then finally in 1910 we get to the Edinburgh World Missions Conference. And that is oftentimes considered today to be the beginning of the world missionary movement. And once after 1910, the one thing to remember about the Edinburgh Conference in terms of mission to Muslims, and there were Anglicans represented there. Some of the main people who put it together were Anglicans, though it was not only Anglican. Couple of the things to remember is that, first of all, the Anglo-Catholics insisted that Edinburgh not include missionaries to South America. Now, why would they do that? This was a World Missions Conference, and it was a conference that was devoted to talking about the evangelization of the unevangelized. So again, unlike the DFMS today, which doesn't really do that, DFMS does not send anyone anywhere, to my knowledge, to evangelize non-Christians. That's exactly what these people are doing. That's why they have Edinburgh 1910, so that they can evangelize non-Christians. And the Anglo-Catholics carry the day. They say, look, if you include South America, just because all these people are Roman Catholic, then we're not going to show up, because those people are every bit as Christian as you or I. And finally, they the coordinators say, fine, no South America. So in that way, the Anglo-Catholics are quite successful in terms of setting up what will be discussed over at this meeting, over at this conference in Edinburgh, Scotland in 1910. Another one of the things that happens is that you have missionaries, missionaries to the Buddhists, to the Hindus, to the animists, and to the traditional religious people in Africa, and they're getting together and they're trying to figure out how they can come up with a theology of history. How can they look at all these new cultures and languages and customs that they've been living with, and to some degree really come to appreciate and cherish in some cases? How can they look at that and reconcile that with a good God who controls history and who has revealed his grace and salvation only in the one person of Jesus Christ? This is a good question. Christians have been talking about it forever, and it's good to talk about it, and I hope we will keep talking about it. You get a lot of facile answers to it, saying, well, everyone's saved. Okay. I don't agree with that. I'm not a universalist, but I know a lot of Episcopalians are. And then you get the other maybe extreme, which is, well, God knows who's elect. If you're elect, you're elect. If you're not elect, there's really nothing you can do about it. So there. You get all kinds of different answers, and I think most of the intelligent conversation happens somewhere in the in-between area there. But anyway, it's a real question. It's a perennial question of the Christian faith, and these people having a profound devotion to Christ, but also being aware not only of the good that they found in Hindu and Buddhist and Muslim cultures, but also being aware of many of the evil things that they found in these cultures. They really have to deal with this question. And by and large, the answer comes out that non-Christian religions should be examined and scrutinized, not uncritically, but they should be understood and be seen and be interpreted as a preparation for the gospel. A preparation for the gospel. So when we look at Hinduism, we should say, what is God doing in Hinduism that comes to fruition in the gospel of Jesus Christ? Okay? Now, in every culture, in every religion, there's going to be positive elements and negative elements. What are the positive elements that God, in his all-knowing grace and sovereignty, has placed in Hinduism that we can use and that we can unfold and develop into the gospel of Christ? Again, not a new idea at all. You can find it all the way back in Justin Martyr, one of a local boy from the city of Nablus, or as it was called back then, Neapolis. Now, you can understand why that might work for Hindus and Buddhists and animists and so on, but take a second and ask yourself, why would that answer not work well for missionaries who are active in the Muslim world? And one of those is Temple Gardner. Temple Gardner is the brilliant linguist, scholar, archiver of writings, missionary that I mentioned just a moment ago. He's not content with that answer. Neither is Samuel Zwemer, who's from the Reformed Church of America, and who is incredibly active in terms of stirring up Americans to engage in mission to Muslims. Why would they not like that? Well, the reason that they find this to be a dissatisfying answer is quite simple, and it's just that Islam came after Christianity. You can't say that this is the appetizer and it's to prepare your hunger for dinner if you get it after dinner. It's something different by definition. And when they look at the Quran, when they look at the Sunnah of the Prophet, of his sayings, they feel very deeply, and I think this is an accurate critique, that Muhammad was either intentionally perverting Christian teachings or he was ignorant of them. He was misconstruing them. And I think that latter critique is obviously right. I mean, if you look at what the Quran seems to say about things like the Trinity, it's very clear that the author has no idea what the doctrine of the Trinity actually says. Same thing with the Incarnation. Very clear that the author of the Quran has no adequate understanding, not even remotely adequate understanding of what Christians believe when they say, Jesus Christ is the Son of God. So how can you then call Islam the preparation for the gospel? It came afterwards. By definition, it cannot be a preparation. It must be a corruption, whether intentional or unintentional. That's the beginning of the modern missionary movement in 1910 in Edinburgh. And then everything changed with the First World War. And with that, I will leave this at its end. Thank you.